that the slavery, it was humane, Islam still looks to abolish it in stages. This is a part of Islamic law, and that can be studied, right? That you abolish slavery in stages. One of the wisdoms in this you can study in American history. You can study the wisdom in Islam doing this in American history. One of the wisdoms, like for example, is in American history, when all the slaves were freed, this created an economic crisis actually, right? Because if you have slavery, right, you have slaves until you have, you know, I forget the number now. I forget the number of slaves. We have a request to pray for Muhammad Kabir. Inshallah, we'll make a dua for the brother. He has cancer. Muhammad Kabir. We'll make a dua for him. So yeah. So the Bible is used to justify slavery in the South. There's no doubt about it. So the slaves, when they were freed, this created an economic crisis. That you had people who were once slaves and they had jobs to do. They had a place in society. And after they're freed, what do they do after they're freed? They don't have their own property. They're not educated. They were slaves before that. They're largely not uneducated. They don't have the means of social access. So we can understand that Islam having a gradual freeing of slaves, we can see the wisdom in it. Let's say Islam came and just freed all of the slaves. No more slaves. Look what happened in the American South. And we're still feeling the effects of it today. They call it the Jim Crow era. So Jim Crow era, where you have blacks who are free, but they're still disenfranchised. They're still second-class citizens. They're still looked down upon in society. They're very, very poor, not given jobs, not given opportunities for education. And there's an economic crisis, right? So this is slavery in America, very, very different to slavery in Islam and the concept of slavery in Islam. If we wanted to be fair, if we want to judge by way of Islam, we'd call American slavery, we'd call it inhumanity. It's not slavery, it's something else. It's inhumanity. It's something bestial. It's bestiality. It's something else. It's inhumanity. The African slave trade, inhumanity. This is not slavery. This is how we should understand it. We have to reframe the conversation. We have to reframe the conversation altogether. Now we think that slavery, the American slavery, is how slavery looked throughout the history. Slavery was very, very different throughout human history. And slavery in Islam is something it's a regulated institution. It's an institution that's regulated to eventually be phased out altogether, right? And even within, Islamic within like Islamic conception of slavery, you had people who became slaves, who were taken as slaves, but then they became the best scholars of Islam, and they were eventually freed. And the names are too many. The names in every single science of Islam, some of the leading scholars of tafsir, for example, former slaves. Some of the leading scholars of the Arabic language are former slaves. Leading scholars of hadith, former slaves. Leading scholars of poetry, former slaves. I'm not making this up. I studied these things. One of these former slaves, his name is Bashar bin Burd. Very, very famous poet. Came from a slave family. They were eventually freed. This is the beauty of Islamic civilization, and we have to study it. Right? So the concept of slavery, very, very different outcomes. And we would say in the first place that slavery in Islam, it's different. The African slave trade was something different. What the modern Europeans did to Africa and other countries in the world, we wouldn't call it slavery. We wouldn't call it many of these names that people are calling it today. To call it colonialism, to call it slavery, it's a misnomer. We need to call it inhumanity. The colonialism, these things, these are like what we'd call euphemism. A euphemism, it's like a name that you have a terrible thing and you call it a nice name, right? So you have a terrible thing, an inhumane thing, a bestial thing, and you put a nice name on it. Colonialism, imperialism, no, it was inhumanity. That's what we'd call it. Inhumanity. Bestiality. This is the names that we should attach to these things. Hope that gives you some insight into how Islam dealt with slavery, how Islam views slavery. I hope that answers some of the question Of course, these things can be studied. If you open any book of Islamic history, it will become very, very clear how slaves and their roles in society. They have interesting roles. You have slaves that were slaves, but were the leading scholars. It's ajib, it's amazing. So you're a slave, but you're like the greatest scholar in your country or your locality in tafsir. Some of the people who are the leading scholars of Quranic recitation, slaves, former slaves. It's ajib, leading scholars. It shows you the nature of Islam and how it uplifts the human being. And just because you may be, you know, quote unquote, a slave or in bondage doesn't mean that you get your humanity taken away. Right? One of the things in Islam, Islam looks to preserve humanity, and that taking any human being that's looking to take away another human being's humanity is punished. Right? So some short analysis, short explanation, but I hope that gives some insight.